Morning, everyone. This is your first ever visit to our church. My name is Darren. I'm the Bible teacher around here, and I've got some great things to teach you this morning. And I thought I'd start with some wine. Seems like a reasonable thing to do. I think it's been well said that the old things in life are best. Old friends, old sofa chairs, old books, old manners, and old wine. Ernest Hemingway said it like this. He said, "Wine is the most civilized and natural thing in the world. It offers a greater range for enjoyment and appreciation than possibly any other sensory thing. Wine," he said, "is life. Wine is life. Wine is life." And the rabbis in the biblical era who shaped the world in which Jesus grew up in and in which Jesus taught would have heartily agreed with that sentiment. They said that without wine, there can be no enjoyment of life. And those of you in the church who come from a Mediterranean background will recognize that sentiment. So for those of you from an Italian or a Greek or a Spanish background, for you to talk about wine is not to talk about fermented grape juice, it's to talk about life. Have a look at this. So this comes from a really bleak bit of the Bible called the book of Jeremiah. Basically, the entire sentiment of the book is depressing and miserable. And in this particular sentence, the depressed writer looks beyond his current circumstances to a happier time. And he says that when that happier time comes, they will rejoice in the bounty of the Lord. And what is the bounty of the Lord? It's the grain, the bread, that feeling you get when you hear the sound of its crust break and you feel its softness and smell its freshness. That's the bounty of the Lord. And there's the wine, and there's the olive oil, and there's the young flocks and herds, there's the lamb, there's the veal, there's all that stuff. They will be like a well-watered garden, and they will sorrow no more. Today they sorrow, but they will sorrow no more. In other words, the biblical writer is saying, one day life will be like this. Here's how we'll live one day. We'll sit out in the sun, and together we'll break artisanal bread, upon which we'll spread the softest of goat cheese and the ripest of brie, and we'll wash it all down with the finest of vintage. And with our friends and our family, we will laugh and have no care in the world. Wine is life. Wine is life. And life is good. It's good. This morning, I want to retell you the well-known story of Jesus' first miracle. The bit of the Bible where he turns water into wine. And to set you up for that story, I want to begin with a little bit of important history. Always a good thing to do. So this fella without pupils in his eyes, you see, is Alexander the Great. He comes from an era of history before pupils were invented. And seriously, pupils were invented in Scotland in the 16th century. And Alexander the Great in the 4th century conquered most of the known world. And the reason he wanted to conquer most of the known world wasn't to get more real estate. It wasn't like, he wanted to buy Greenland. So, or anything like that. So he could just have more stuff. Alexander the Great wasn't a conqueror in the traditional sense. He was an evangelist. And the thing that he wanted to evangelize was what he considered to be the enlightened culture of ancient Greece. So Alexander didn't come from Greece, but he learned Greek mathematics. He learned Greek science, Greek poetry, Greek philosophy. And as a young man, he got it into his head to spread this enlightened culture around the world, because the rest of the world is barbarian. So he conquers most of the known world with this idea to make the world Greek. Alexander dies prematurely in 323 BC when he was like 31, 32 years old. After his death, his successors take on his passion and succeed pretty much in turning the world Greek. So what you find happening in the 3rd and the 2nd and the 1st centuries before Christ is from Europe all throughout the Near East, Mesopotamia, pretty much as far as the borders of India, the world becomes more and more Greek. People get into Greek learning, they get into eating Slovaki, ouzo becomes popular, you know the drill. Greek becomes ubiquitous. And in the conservative and traditional and insular world of ancient Israel, where Jesus comes from, this Greekness causes tensions and problems. For example, conservative religious Jews didn't appreciate nakedness, and yet all over Israel, Greek gymnasiums opened up where people worked out naked. Conservative Jews didn't appreciate eroticism. All over Israel, Greek theatres opened up, and they often build erotic Greek dramas. Conservative Jews very much appreciated the learning of the Torah. They were always into the books of Moses and all that stuff. And yet young people became more and more into Plato and Homer and Euripides. And so during this period, the 3rd, the 2nd, the 1st century before Christ, what you find going on in Israel is young Jewish men and women are abandoning Jewishness and trying to become more and more Greek. Jewishness is unfashionable, Greekness is in. While this is going on, a group of religious Jewish men called Pharisees began to object. Their thing was to preserve traditional Jewish culture, to preserve traditional Jewish religion and faith in the face of what they saw as ubiquitous and nasty and dirty Greek culture. And in that regard, Pharisees are aptly named. The word Pharisee literally means to separate. And that was their thing. They believed that the world was dirty. They believed that the world was immoral. They believed that the world was unclean. And so the only way to be good was to separate yourself from it. So being a Pharisee in Jesus' day was all about walking around your village and saying, that's dirty, that's wrong, that's immoral, everything I see in the world about me is just ew. They kind of had religious OCD. And so the only way to be right with God, the only way to live an undamaged life, the only way to live an unbroken life, a whole life, a happy life, is to separate yourself from, quote-unquote, the world. Now, this is important. Because these people believed that the Greek culture or the world was inherently dirty, they further believed that it was actually impossible to live within that dirty world without becoming contaminated by its dirtiness. And so whenever and wherever they could, they would wash. Not for hygienic reasons, but for religious reasons. And this washing was pure symbolism. They would pour water over their hands 3 times, and they would say out loud, the culture in which I live is dirty, and so I cleanse myself. The world in which I live is dirty, and so I cleanse myself. The world in which I live is dirty, and so I cleanse myself. I separate myself from everything around me, and then I become unbroken. Then I become whole. Then I'm okay with God. This seems silly to us, of course, but these people, remember, seriously believe that the washings that they do separate themselves from the immoral Greek culture in which they live. And they seriously believe that without these washings, they could somehow ingest the immorality of the world in which they live and become unclean. And because they believed that, they further believed that just as long as a person washed their hands 3 times, As long as they said this, I separate myself from the world in which I live. As long as they did this, as long as they performed this rite, this ritual, this function, that meant they were okay. That meant they were undamaged, unbroken, and all right with the God who is their judge. And to facilitate all these washings, these things were everywhere. So what you see here is a 1st century stone water jar from Israel. And I latched on this particular photo because of the fella standing next to it, because I want you to get a sense of the scale, how big these water jars are. So, 1st century, the world in which Jesus lives, these water jars are everywhere. Every home has one. Every shop has one, every street corner is packed with them. Stone was thought to be impervious to water and therefore impervious to moral contamination. And so as often as they could, many, many times a day, good, decent Bible reading, prayer saying, God-fearing Jews would walk up to these water jars and wash their hands and separate themselves from the culture in which they lived, and make themselves okay with God. Bible. Gospel according to St. John chapter 2, verse 1. The evangelist tells us that on the 3rd day a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and the disciples had also been invited to the wedding. The first thing that strikes me about this sentence is that the writer says, I'm going to tell you a story. And the first thing I want you to understand about this story is that it takes place on the 3rd day. And that piques my interest because no matter how hard you try to understand and figure out the days in John's story, this just doesn't make any chronological sense, and it should make sense because John is writing in the 1st century on parchment. And parchment in the 1st century is ruinously expensive, and because it's ruinously expensive, whenever anyone wrote everything, it always made sense. It was always an important detail. There was no frivolous information ever put onto parchment in the 1st century. Words are always chosen carefully. And so what on earth does John mean when he places this story about water getting turned into wine in the context of the 3rd day? Why tell us this information? Very simple. John writes this story for the benefit of the early church. And one of the principal creeds in the early church is that Jesus died and was buried and rose again on the 3rd day. They believed that this Jesus rising on the 3rd day was a story that changed everything. And this is why John begins this story with a reference to the 3rd day. It's his way of saying, guys, this story that we believe, this thing that we hold on to, this story that changed everything, began with wine at a wedding. Moving on. In the ancient world, weddings were, how can I say it delicately, they were somewhat heroic affairs, if I can put it like that. For example, a wedding in 1st century Palestine typically went on for 7 days. Can you imagine? And I think in every culture in fact I know in every culture, there are certain social conventions that govern what does and doesn't happen at a wedding. That's true in our culture too. So say that you're going to get married in Woodbridge. You're laughing, this should be fun. What are the conventions of getting married in Woodbridge? Well, there's a certain expectation that you'll rent out one of those banquet halls. That's a convention. There is a further convention that at the wedding you will provide food for your guests. And There's a further convention that the foods will come in enough courses to satisfy the appetite of a small hippopotamus. And then after you eat all those courses, you'll walk out of there feeling like a small hippopotamus. There is a further convention that in addition to providing lots of food to eat, there will also be an open bar. Right? There's certain social niceties. And if you go to a wedding and those conventions are not observed, people talk. Right? You go to the wedding, hey, it's a cash bar. You're kidding me, right? No, it's a cash bar. And everyone talks. It's midnight. Where's the porchetta? There's no porchetta. You kidding me? There's no porchetta. Can you believe these people? And no one remembers the wedding. They just remember how you broke social convention. And so the pressure on you financially is not to break social convention. Because you don't want to look cheap. And on the other side of the equation, if you get invited to a wedding in Woodbridge, there is a convention that you will bring not a toaster or tea towels, but a wee envelope with, what's the going rate these days?
A lot.
No, what is the going rate? There's a number. You know what the number is. What's the number?
250.
250. That sound about right?
Low.
That low? Do you see what I'm saying? There's certain conventions, there's certain things, and people know the kind of ballpark figure. Your end of the deal is to give me enough food to eat and drink to drink, and the other end of the deal is you bring a wee envelope with 250 per guest. Everyone's happy. It's like a net zero kind of game. That's how things work. It's a good system. And in first century Palestine, where this story happens, the convention is that the groom, it was always his responsibility, had to provide enough food and wine for the guests to eat and drink for a period of 7 days. That was the deal. So clearly this is an enormous undertaking. And so the reciprocal convention was that if you got invited to one of these 7-day eat fests and drink fests, you had to give a gift that kind of compensated. So it worked out, everyone won. I eat and drink for 7 days, I pay for food and drink for 7 days, everyone's even, everyone's happy, everyone has a good time. That's the deal. So firmly fixed were these conventions in the ancient world, if anyone broke their side of the deal, you could sue them. Right? So if you got invited to a wedding in the ancient world and you took along your wee envelope with $250, 500 if you went as a couple, and they fed you crackers and cheese and it was a cash bar, you're feeling ripped off. And so consequently, you were legally entitled to sue them. So this sentence, we read that Jesus' mother and Jesus' disciples, how many were there? Were at the wedding. Now as a Scotsman, I cannot help but notice that's a lot of mouths to feed. Some of the disciples are fishermen. I know fishermen. Fishermen can drink. They've practiced. Give these guys an open bar for 7 days, a buffet for 7 days. It's going to cost a fortune. Next sentence. Sure enough. When the wine was gone. How? What do you mean? How can the wine be gone? This is an oxymoron. The wine cannot be gone. What a depressing sentence. The wine is gone. Wine, remember, in the cultures of the East is life. When the wine is gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." What do you mean, no more wine? So what's happening at this point is Jesus is with the men in one room. People separated in those days, and I don't know, they're watching UFC, talking about man things, I don't know. And Mary, the mother of Jesus, is in another room, and she overhears some of the kitchen staff say that the wine is gone. And in the social conventions in the ancient world, this is a taboo statement. The wine cannot be gone, even religiously. The wine cannot be gone. In the Talmud, it actually says that without wine, there is no enjoyment of life. You simply cannot, in first century Palestine, have a wineless wedding. And so, the effect of this statement on the guests at the party is devastating. There is no more wine. Over. I don't know why they ran out of wine. Maybe they misjudged the number of guests. Maybe some of the guests that came drank too much, not pointing any elbows, but the original invitation was Mary, Jesus, maybe +1, I don't know. You know, when you show up with 12, I don't see a plus 12. You know, you kind of pressured us to invite your plus 12 guests. Maybe Mary's saying, hey, Jesus, I brought a gift. Did you bring a gift? It's $250 in an envelope. I brought mine. Did you bring yours? And what about the 12 hairy dudes? Did they bring $250 in an envelope? Because they're eating and drinking like they did. I don't know. Maybe there's some kind of subtle accusation here, perhaps. What is certain, however, is that the groom who throws this wedding is now facing years of social stigma. Until he's an old man, he's going to be forced to live with the shame of being the guy at whose wedding the wine was gone. The wine was gone. You know, in the Talmud, it's like a Jewish Bible. There's actually there's a list of activities in the Talmud that constitute stealing. And included in that list of misbehaviours is not providing your guests with enough food to eat or wine to drink. It's actually theft in the ancient world. You're stealing from me. And it's a fair point. I gave you $250, you're giving me crackers and cheese. Not cool. Not cool. So Mary's looking at Jesus, and she's looking at Jesus like it's Jesus' problem. Don't you love that? It's not Jesus' wedding. Jesus didn't throw the party. He's just sitting there chilling with his friends, having a good time. No reason to imagine any otherwise. And suddenly Mary is like hand on the hip, and she's talking to Jesus like this is Jesus' fault, it's Jesus' problem. Somehow Jesus needs to fix it. And you know, it's not cool what she does. It's not cool. Jesus is with his friends, and his mother comes in and starts nagging him, and I think that's why he's so dismissive of her. Notice what he says in verse 4. He says, woman, it's his mother he's talking to. Woman, why do you involve me? That's a great sentence, by the way. Why do you involve me? Don't you hate it when people try and involve you? Like, I got my problems, you got your problems. Don't involve me. I can't fix my own problems. How am I going to fix yours? Don't involve me. Those of you who were raised with a very high view of Mary, the Mother of God, will no doubt raise an eyebrow at this sentence, because Jesus is being unquestionably rude. Not only is he calling his mother woman, he's saying, you know, what do you want me to do? It's almost as if he's distancing himself from her. And you see this right throughout all four of the Gospels, actually. Jesus seems to draw quite clear boundaries between him and his mother, almost as if he's saying, he doesn't explicitly say it, but it's almost as if he's saying, you know what, I came from heaven to die for the sins of everyone, including you. I'm here to provide for the salvation of everyone, including you. And that's going to happen on the cross, and you have to relate to me in the same terms as everyone else. Woman. It's kind of how it seems to be. So I'm sorry, woman, but this ain't my problem. This ain't my problem. Go and bug someone else. And when Jesus says to her, you know, my hour has not yet come. Notice that phrase, my hour has not yet come. What he's saying there is, if I get up from the sofa, where I'm currently relaxed and having a good time, thanks very much. If I get up from this sofa and fix this no wine situation, here's what's going to happen. It's going to set in motion a chain of events that will end up in Jerusalem on the cross. And that is where it's going to go, but right now I'm not ready. Right now I'm relaxed, I'm having a good time, and can you just leave me alone? Can you give me peace for a minute? I'm not ready. However, despite his protestations, he obviously agrees to do something, which is why in the next sentence his mother goes back to the kitchen and says to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Then it gets interesting. John tells us that nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by Jews for ceremonial washing, the kind the Bible teacher told you about 5 minutes ago, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. At this point, the angels in heaven are looking at one another and they're going, no, he's not. Sure he's not going to do that. He's going to use the water jars, the ones used for religion? No, he is. He is. You remember a moment or two, I said that these words that John writes are written on parchment, and that parchment is expensive, and because parchment is expensive, words were never ever wasted. Every word counted. No word was superfluous. Remember I told you that? Yes, Darren, we hang upon your every word. Why, therefore, given that that is so, does John bother to tell us that there were 6 water jars? I don't care. It makes no difference to me as a reader of the story whether there's 4, 5, 6 or 16. For me the story is the same, the headline is the same. Jesus turns water into wine. It's fine, it's good, that's the story. Why bother with this? Here's what this says to a first century Jew. In ancient Jewish culture, the perfect number is always the number 7. So in Jewish culture, things are not like 10 out of 10, they're always 7 out of 7. So if you were out at a restaurant and you just had the best steak you'd ever eaten, and the server said to you, "How did you enjoy your steak?" you would say, "You know what? It was amazing, it was awesome, it was perfect, it was a 7. If you were going out with your wife and she asked you how she looked in that dress she just bought, you would say, "Darling, you look amazing, you are a 7. You are an absolute 7, no questions asked." And that being the case, the number that first century Jews always used in antithesis to the perfect number 7 was always the number 6. So if you were at a swanky restaurant and you just dropped $80 on the worst steak you'd ever eaten, and your server asked you if you enjoyed your meal, you would say, "No, I didn't. It was awful. It was oversalted, undercooked and undersauced. It was a 6. I'm going to go on TripAdvisor and you're getting a 6. In first century Palestine, to say that something is 6 is to say that something just isn't right. It just doesn't work. It just fails in every conceivable way. This is why in the last book of the Bible, the number of the beast is referred to as 666. So nearby there are jars of water. Not water for drinking, but religious water. Water used to undo the damage of life. Water used to fix the brokenness of life. Water used to kind of make you feel that you are okay with God and that somehow your future will be better than your past. Water to give you a deep sense of hope that the things you are going through today won't last forever, but they will result in a place of bread and wine and lamb and veal and family and friends. And there were 6 of them. Do you see the subtlety of what John is saying? All of the mumbo-jumbo of your religion and all of your washing hands and all of the things that you're hoping in, it fails in every way. It fixes nothing. It forgives nothing. It cleanses nothing. It solves nothing. It is nothing. It is a 6. It is a 6. It is a 6. It is useless. Next sentence. Jesus says, fill the jars with water. I like to think Jesus is smiling mischievously at this point. So they filled them to the brim. Why did they fill them to the brim? Because at a wedding where you're eating and drinking for 7 days, people are misbehaving. And when people are misbehaving in this culture, when people are reminded at family events of how broken things are and how damaged things are, they're going to these water jars all the time. Fix me. Make it right. Give me hope. Reconcile this. Undamage this. Unbreak this. That's why the jars are empty. Jesus says, fill them to the top. Next sentence. Then he told them, draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet. Now, when you threw a party in the ancient world, in addition to hiring a DJ and a photographer, you would hire someone called a symposiarch. And the job of the symposiarch, I suppose this is where we get our word sommelier from, maybe, I don't know. His job was to make sure that all the guests are having a good time and to make sure that none of the guests were drinking too much and getting too out of order. And the way the symposiarch did this was by regulating not only the quantity of the wine that was being served, but also the strength of the wine that was being served. So it would work like this. The symposiarch would sit in a sort of elevated position, and he would look at how everyone was doing. And if people were getting a little out of hand, he would say, water it down. Add water to the wine, reduce the ABV to 2% or something like that, and we'll leave it there for a couple of hours and let everyone kind of level out. However, if you looked out at the party and everyone's like miserable, everyone's looking like they're sucking on lemons, serve the wine at its normal strength, maybe add some to it, I don't know, let's liven things up here. That was his job. Always make sure people are having just the right amount of fun, not too much, not too little. And so one of the ways he did it, he would just sample. Everything that was served, he would always sample it first. So they take the wine that Jesus has just made out of water in the religious water jars, and they take it to the sommelier. And we read in verse 9 that the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He didn't know where it came from, but the servants who had drawn the water knew. Notice that little detail. So in the Gospels, there's a lot of knowing and not knowing. There's a lot of seeing and not seeing. There's a lot of understanding and not understanding. And what you get here is a little bit of a social statement that's 100% gospel. The important people at the wedding don't have a Scooby-Doo. The guy in charge of the wine doesn't know nothing about the wine. But the servants, the guys who show up to work with a hairnet and a name tag, the guys who struggle, who scrape their way through life, who hustle their way from bill to bill, from problem to problem, from situation to situation, they get it. They see. They know what's up. They understand. The gospel is what? Good news to the poor. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, everyone brings out the choice wine first and then the cheapo stuff after everyone's had too much to drink. But you, my friend, saved the best to last. I hope, by the way, that last few words will one day be a commentary on your life. The best to last. The best to last. So anyway, the normal practice, pretty sensible I think, was to start with the good stuff. The guests arrive, everyone's kind of fresh, then you serve the Chateauneuf de Pape. Everyone's palate is sensitive, everyone appreciates your fine taste and how generous you are serving the expensive stuff. And then once everyone's had a few, you bring out the nasty stuff from Peely Island or whatever. And who cares? It all tastes the same after a few anyway. Doesn't matter. Then John says that what Jesus did in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory. and his disciples believed him. What is a sign? A sign is an action or a gesture that points, I'm reading this out of the dictionary, an action or a gesture that points to the existence of something that is not immediately apparent. There's a lot of things in your life not immediately apparent. Healing, happiness, security, peace. Lots of good stuff. Not all immediately apparent. What did Jesus do in this story? What was the sign? The headline is not that he turned water into wine. That's not what this story is about. Turning water into wine is the subheadline. The headline is Jesus violated religion. He took the thing that everyone thought was the thing that fixed the brokenness and the shame and the guilt, the thing that people brought forgiveness and hope and healing. He took that thing that people thought was the thing, and he said that thing is garbage. Let's just use it for wine, because it's fit for nothing else. That was the sign. That was what this story was about. He's saying no amount of mumbo-jumbo can make you right with God. No amount of mumbo-jumbo, whatever it is, can fix what's broken and heal what's damaged and whatever it is you need. He's saying in this, one day, I'll fix it. It's not apparent yet, it's just a sign, but one day I'll fix it. I'll heal it. I'll cleanse it. It'll start with me dying on the cross for you. But it will really become apparent to you at the last. Because I'm saving the best to last. On that last page of the Bible. When all's said and done. When they've hurt you as much as they're going to hurt you. When you've carried as much shame as you can carry and much pain as you can cope with. When all's said and done. What does it say on the last page? And now. And now. From now until forever. There will be no more pain. No more tears. No more sorrow. For the old order of things has passed away. And until such times, our business is the business of hoping and holding on to hope, believing and holding on to belief, and having faith and holding on to faith, believing that one day, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but one day we will see that the best has been saved to last. Until then, we hang on. God bless you. Thank you for coming. See you next Sunday.